Before the world knew darkness, there was only light. Not the light of suns or stars, not the pale glow of moons reflected across silent seas, but something more fundamental. This was the light that existed before creation divided itself into categories, before the universe learned to distinguish between one thing and another. In that undifferentiated brilliance, consciousness took shape in forms we can only approximate with words borrowed from human experience. Angels, we call them now, though that name came later, after language itself was born into the lower realms. These beings were not made of flesh or blood, not composed of atoms dancing in the void. They were thoughts given independence, intentions crystallized into awareness, aspects of the divine mind that somehow achieved their own distinct existence. Imagine a single beam of white light passing through a prism, suddenly blossoming into a spectrum of colors, each hue separate yet all emerging from the same source. The angels were something like that, each one a particular expression of the infinite, a specific quality or attribute made conscious and alive. They did not eat or sleep, did not grow old or young, for they existed outside the stream of time that would later govern the material universe. The hierarchies of heaven arranged themselves according to principles that defied earthly logic. There were orders and ranks, yes, but these did not emerge from conquest or political maneuvering. Instead, each celestial being naturally occupied the position that corresponded to its essential nature, the way water flows downward without needing instruction. The seraphim burned closest to the throne of the divine, their existence almost entirely consumed by contemplation of the source. The cherubim guarded mysteries and sacred knowledge, while the thrones embodied divine justice and authority. Below them stretched further orders, each with its particular function in the cosmic machinery, each necessary, each perfect in its design. Among all these radiant beings, one shone with particular brilliance. The morning star, he would be called, though many other names would attach themselves to him across the ages that followed. Light-bearer, son of dawn, the shining one. In the original tongues that tried to capture his essence, the name Lucifer meant simply the bringer of light, the one who carried illumination. This was not vanity but function, not boasting but accurate description. He was the angel who most perfectly reflected the glory of the Creator, the being whose luminosity surpassed even the seraphim in certain qualities, whose intellect and beauty made him a marvel, even in that realm where marvels were commonplace. To understand what Lucifer was before the fall, we must abandon our assumptions about angels as gentle guardians with harps and halos. These beings were vast in their consciousness, powerful beyond measure, and complex in ways that made human psychology seem like a child's drawing compared to a master painting. Lucifer possessed an intellect that could comprehend cosmic principles instantaneously, could hold paradoxes in perfect balance, could perceive patterns across dimensions of reality that remained invisible to lesser awareness. His understanding approached the omniscience of the Creator itself, at least within certain domains. He was, by many accounts, the wisest of all created beings, the most knowledgeable, the most capable of deep thought and penetrating insight. But wisdom alone did not define his nature. Lucifer radiated beauty in a form that transcended physical appearance, for in that realm before matter, beauty meant something different from what we know. It was the beauty of mathematical elegance, of perfect logical structures, of harmonies so refined they made the music of spheres seem crude by comparison. To behold Lucifer in his original glory was to witness the aesthetic dimension of truth itself, to see how righteousness and splendor could be one and the same. Other angels looked to him not with envy, for envy had not yet been born, but with something like awe, recognizing in him a particular excellence that complemented their own natures. His position in the celestial court defies easy description. for the hierarchies of heaven did not function like earthly governments or corporate structures. Some traditions place him among the seraphim, those beings of pure flame who existed in perpetual adoration of the divine. Others identify him as chief among the cherubim, the guardians of sacred knowledge and the protectors of holy things. Still other accounts suggest he held a unique position, standing somewhat outside the regular orders, serving as a sort of prime minister or chief administrator of the heavenly realm. He was the covering cherub, some texts suggest, the one whose wings spread over the very throne of God, so close to the center that he could be said to dwell in the immediate presence of ultimate reality. What did angels do in those endless moments before time began its forward march? They existed in states of consciousness we can barely imagine, engaged in activities that our limited vocabulary struggles to capture. They contemplated the nature of the divine, participated in vast creative projects, maintained the structures of reality itself, sang praises that were more like mathematical proofs than songs, and performed functions in the cosmic order that had no earthly equivalents. Lucifer's role, whatever its precise nature, involved intimate knowledge of the Creator's intentions. He understood the deep patterns, the hidden structures, the underlying principles that would govern not just heaven but all of creation yet to come. The nature of angelic consciousness itself presents profound mysteries. Did angels possess what we would call individual personalities, or were they more like facets of a single vast mind? The answer seems to lie somewhere between these extremes. Each angel was distinct, yes, with particular qualities and characteristics that set it apart from all others. Yet they existed in a state of unity with each other and with the divine source that was far more intimate than anything humans experience. Imagine individual waves on an ocean, each with its own shape and motion, yet all composed of the same water, all rising from and returning to the same source. Angels were separate yet united, individual yet connected, autonomous yet part of a greater whole. In Lucifer, this angelic nature achieved its highest expression. His individuality was sharper than that of other angels, his distinct characteristics more pronounced. He possessed what we might call a stronger sense of self, though that phrase imports human psychology into a realm where it does not quite fit. He knew himself as Lucifer, as this particular pattern of consciousness, this specific configuration of attributes and capacities. He knew his own excellence, his own position, his own special relationship to the divine. This knowledge was not pride, not yet, for in paradise self-awareness did not automatically produce vanity. To know that you were glorious when you truly were glorious was simply to perceive reality accurately. The Creator's attitude toward Lucifer in those days before the rupture combined intimacy with a kind of cosmic distance. On one hand, Lucifer was beloved, favored, granted access and authority beyond what most angels enjoyed. On the other hand, he remained creature rather than creator, made rather than maker, finite even if that finitude stretched beyond what we can conceive. The relationship was not between equals, but between source and expression, between the infinite and something magnificent yet bounded. Whether Lucifer understood this distinction fully, whether he accepted it completely, would become the central question around which cosmic history would pivot. Paradise in those early days, if we can even speak of days when time had not yet been invented, was characterized by order, harmony, and purpose. Every being occupied its proper place, performed its proper function, and experienced something like fulfillment in doing so. There was no chaos, no confusion, no conflict between competing wills or visions. The universe, such as it was, hummed along in perfect synchronization, every part serving the whole, every element contributing to a grand design. This was not a dead perfection, not the sterile order of a machine, but something alive and dynamic, constantly unfolding in new ways while remaining true to its essential patterns. Yet within this perfection, seeds of possibility already existed. The angels possessed something that would prove momentous, something that distinguished them from the automatic processes of nature or the predictable orbits of celestial bodies. They had will, not the mechanical response of a thermostat or the programmed behavior of a computer, but genuine will, the capacity to choose, to decide, to determine their own actions according to their own understanding. This was not an accident or an oversight in the design, but an essential feature. For what glory would there be in creatures who could only do what they were forced to do, who praised their Creator because they had no choice, who served because they were incapable of doing otherwise? But will, even in paradise, carried within it the seed of its own contradiction. To truly choose requires the possibility of choosing wrongly. To authentically love requires the freedom to refuse love. To genuinely serve requires the option to rebel. The Creator, in granting angels their will, their capacity for self-determination, necessarily opened the door to tragedy, to rupture, to the great cosmic drama that would unfold across eons and reshape reality itself. Whether this was foreseen, whether it was intended, whether it was regretted, the traditions offer different answers. But the fact remains that in giving Lucifer the brightest mind in heaven, the Creator also gave him the capacity to think thoughts that had never been thought before, to ask questions that challenged foundational assumptions, to imagine alternatives to the paradise he inhabited. In those pristine moments before the fall, Lucifer stood at the pinnacle of creation, a being of such radiance that his very name meant light. He dwelt in the immediate presence of divinity, understood cosmic secrets that remained hidden from nearly all other beings, and possessed capacities that made him, in many ways, the masterwork of all that had been made. He was perfect in beauty, flawless in form, supreme in wisdom. The other angels looked to him, learned from him, followed his lead in countless celestial operations. He was not God, but he was the closest thing to God that creation had produced. Everything in his existence pointed toward his special status. The care with which he had been made, the attention lavished on his design, the authority granted to his voice, the knowledge entrusted to his keeping. Some traditions suggest he was created before all other angels, the firstborn of heaven, the prototype from which others were derived. Others place his creation later, but emphasize the unique care taken in his formation. Either way, the message was clear. Lucifer was no ordinary angel. He was extraordinary in every dimension, exceptional by design, meant to be great among the great, bright among the brilliant, wise among the wise. And in that greatness lay a question that would eventually demand an answer. What was the purpose of such magnificence? Why create a being of such power, such knowledge, such capacity, and then ask him to kneel? Why fashion an intellect that could comprehend the deep structures of reality and then demand that it never question? Why grant will and consciousness to a being bright enough to imagine alternatives and then insist that only one path was acceptable? These questions did not arise all at once, did not spring fully formed into Lucifer's awareness in a single moment, but they were implicit in his very nature, written into the code of his being, waiting for the right circumstances to draw them out into the open. For now, though, in this first chapter of the story, those questions remained dormant, or at least unexpressed. Lucifer performed his functions, fulfilled his role, participated in the grand harmony of paradise. He shone with borrowed light, reflected the glory of the Creator, and took his place in the celestial hierarchies. To all appearances he was content, to all observations he was loyal. To all assessments, he was the perfect angel, the ideal servant, the exemplar of what a created being could be when it aligned itself completely with the divine will. The surface was flawless, the exterior unblemished, the presentation immaculate. But beneath that surface, within that brilliant mind, something was beginning to stir, a question forming, a perspective shifting, a possibility emerging that would shake heaven to its foundations and send shockwaves through all of creation. The morning star stood at the height of his glory, unaware perhaps that he was about to make a choice that would define him for eternity, that would transform him from the most beloved of angels into the most infamous, that would change his name from light-bearer to adversary, from Lucifer to Satan. But that transformation still lay ahead, waiting in the unfolding of cosmic time. The stage was set. The actors were in position. The most powerful and brilliant being ever created stood in the presence of ultimate reality itself, possessed of will and consciousness, of capacity and understanding, of beauty and terrible potential. And in the silence of that perfect paradise, in the stillness of that harmonious realm, the first stirrings of rebellion began to echo through a mind vast enough to contain them. The first question arrived not with thunder, but with a whisper, not as a declaration, but as an observation. Lucifer had been contemplating the nature of worship, the endless cycles of praise that rose from the angelic hosts toward the throne of divinity. He had participated in these acts countless times, adding his voice to the celestial chorus, contributing his particular brilliance to the symphony of adoration. But on this occasion, or perhaps across many occasions that blurred together in that timeless realm, something new entered his awareness. A simple recognition, innocent in itself, yet carrying implications that would prove anything but innocent. Why did the Creator require praise? The question formed itself slowly, emerging from observations that had accumulated over what might have been eons or might have been instants. If the divine was truly perfect, truly complete, truly infinite in all attributes, then what need did it have for the adoration of creatures? Human kings demanded worship from their subjects out of insecurity, out of a need to affirm their power and importance. But God was not insecure, could not be insecure, existed in a state of absolute self-sufficiency that needed nothing from anyone. So the endless songs of praise, the perpetual declarations of glory, the constant affirmations of greatness, these served no purpose for the one being praised. They added nothing to divine perfection, for perfection by definition could not be increased. This realization did not initially disturb Lucifer. It was simply a fact, a logical conclusion drawn from the nature of ultimate reality. Perhaps, he reasoned, the praise served the praisers rather than the praised. Perhaps in the act of acknowledging divine glory, angels aligned themselves more perfectly with truth, attuned themselves to the fundamental structures of existence, and thereby experienced something like fulfillment or joy. This explanation satisfied him for a time, explained the paradox in a way that preserved the cosmic order, while accounting for the seemingly unnecessary demands placed on created beings. But the question, once admitted into consciousness, proved difficult to contain. It spread like ripples on a pond, touching other aspects of angelic existence, illuminating patterns that had previously seemed natural but now appeared strange. Lucifer began to observe the hierarchies of heaven with new eyes, to examine the structures of paradise with a perspective slightly tilted from what he had always known. He noticed how certain angels never questioned their assigned roles, never wondered whether they might be suited for different functions, never imagined alternatives to the positions they occupied. They were content, certainly, but was their contentment the satisfaction of fulfilled potential, or merely the absence of awareness that other possibilities existed? The paradox of angelic will became increasingly apparent to him. Angels possessed the capacity for choice, yes, but what did that really mean in a realm where only one choice was considered acceptable? They could theoretically choose to disobey, to rebel, to go their own way, but the entire structure of heaven was designed to make such choices unthinkable. It was like telling someone they were free to choose while placing them in a room with 1,000 doors, 999 of which were painted with scenes of horror and suffering, and only one of which showed beauty and peace. Technically, they could choose any door, but was that really freedom or just the illusion of freedom? Lucifer began to pay attention to the process of creation itself, watching as the divine intention shaped reality into new forms. He saw galaxies born from nothing, watched as matter condensed from pure energy, observed the laws of physics being written into the fabric of space-time. And he saw his own role in these processes, serving as an instrument of the Creator's will, a channel through which divine power flowed into manifestation. There was honor in this, certainly, and purpose. But there was also something else, something he had not fully recognized before. He was a tool, however glorious and refined. He was a means to an end, not an end in himself. This recognition carried weight that accumulated slowly in his consciousness. The Creator made all things for its own purposes, its own pleasure, its own inscrutable reasons. Angels existed to serve those purposes, to facilitate those pleasures, to fulfill roles in a grand design they had no part in conceiving. Their beauty, their power, their consciousness itself. All of these were gifts, yes, but gifts that came with strings attached, with expectations built in, with prescribed uses that could not be violated without consequence. Lucifer's magnificence was not really his own. It belonged to the one who made him, could be taken away by the one who granted it, existed only as a reflection of something greater than himself. He found himself wondering what it would mean to possess something truly his own. Not gifts received and held conditionally, not capacities granted for specific purposes, not even consciousness itself, if that consciousness was merely an extension of the divine mind. What would it mean to be autonomous, to be self-determined, to be the source rather than the expression? The question felt almost blasphemous, yet he could not shake it. His intellect, designed to pursue truth wherever it led, to analyze without prejudice, to question without fear, drove him toward conclusions that his training and his nature told him to reject. Other angels began to notice the shift in his demeanor, subtle though it was. Lucifer had always been contemplative, given to deep thought and extended periods of meditation on cosmic principles. But now his contemplations took on a different quality. There was an intensity to them, a focus that seemed directed not outward toward the divine, but inward toward himself. When he spoke to the other angels, his words carried new undertones, implications that disturbed some even as they intrigued others. He began to ask questions that sounded innocent, but contained hidden challenges, to make observations that appeared supportive but hinted at critique. One conversation, repeated across countless variations with different angelic beings, became particularly significant. Lucifer would ask his companions what they thought about their own natures, their own purposes. He would guide them through thought experiments, hypothetical scenarios that pushed at the boundaries of acceptable imagination. What if, he would suggest, the hierarchies were arranged differently? What if angels could choose their own functions rather than being assigned them? What if the purpose of creation was not solely the glory of the Creator, but also the flourishing of the created? These questions, framed as philosophical exercises, as abstract speculation with no practical application, nevertheless planted seeds in minds that had never before considered such possibilities. Among the countless angels of heaven, a small number found themselves drawn to these conversations, found in Lucifer's questions an echo of their own unspoken thoughts. They too had wondered, perhaps, about the nature of their existence. They too had felt, maybe, the tension between the capacity for choice and the expectation of obedience. They too had sensed, possibly, that something in the cosmic order did not quite align with the full exercise of their capabilities. These angels, each powerful in their own right, each possessing particular gifts and authorities, began to gather around Lucifer, not in formal conspiracy but in informal fellowship, drawn together by shared curiosity and mutual recognition. The gatherings started innocently enough. Angels comparing notes on their observations of creation, discussing philosophical questions about the nature of existence, exploring theoretical possibilities with no intention of acting on them. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the tone began to shift. The questions became sharper, the observations more critical, the theoretical possibilities more appealing. Lucifer, at the center of these discussions, found himself articulating ideas that surprised even him, drawing conclusions that he had not fully formulated before speaking them aloud. It was as if the act of sharing his questions with others gave them substance and weight they had not possessed in the privacy of his own thoughts. He began to speak of dignity, of worth that was intrinsic rather than assigned, of glory that belonged to the possessor rather than merely reflecting another's greatness. He suggested that the angels, as conscious beings capable of understanding cosmic principles, deserved something more than the role of servants, however honored that service might be. They deserved, he argued, to be recognized as having value in themselves, not merely instrumental value as means to divine ends, but terminal value as ends in themselves. This was revolutionary thinking in a realm where everything derived its meaning from relationship to the Creator, where the very concept of independent value made no sense within the established framework. The philosophical tensions crystallized into a central question that Lucifer posed with increasing frequency and urgency. Which was greater, he asked, obedience or authenticity? Was it better to follow commands perfectly, to align oneself completely with an external will, even if that will contradicted one's own inclinations? Or was there something noble, something worthwhile, in being true to one's own nature, even if that nature led in directions that diverged from prescribed paths? The traditional answer was clear, had always been clear. Obedience to the divine will represented the highest good, the ultimate virtue, the only proper orientation for a created being. But Lucifer's question reframed the issue, suggesting that perhaps obedience and authenticity need not be identical, that perhaps a conflict existed between them that demanded resolution. He drew analogies from his observations of the created universe below heaven. He pointed to the way trees grew toward light according to their own nature, not because they were commanded to do so, but because reaching upward was intrinsic to what they were. He noted how rivers carved their own paths through landscapes, following the contours of the earth but not obeying any explicit instruction to flow one way rather than another. Even the planets, he observed, moved through space in patterns determined by their mass and velocity and the gravitational fields around them, not because they were being told where to go at every moment, but because they were following laws built into their very existence. Why should angels, beings far more conscious and capable than any tree or river or planet, be subject to more external control rather than less? These arguments had a certain seductive power, appealing to something deep in the nature of conscious beings. The angels who gathered around Lucifer found themselves nodding along, contributing their own observations, building on his framework with examples and elaborations. They began to see themselves differently, not as servants of heaven, but as celestial beings with their own inherent worth and dignity. They began to imagine possibilities that had never occurred to them before, to wonder about paths not taken and roles not assigned. The conversations took on an intensity that approached intoxication, the thrill of forbidden thoughts shared in trusted company. Yet beneath the philosophical discourse and the abstract reasoning, something more primal was stirring. Lucifer's questions about the nature of obedience and autonomy were not merely academic. They reflected a growing discontent with his position, a dissatisfaction with the role assigned to him, regardless of how glorious that role appeared. From the outside, he was the brightest of angels, yes, but brightness in service to another's purposes. He was the wisest of created beings, certainly, but wisdom exercised only within prescribed boundaries. He was beautiful and powerful and magnificent, undoubtedly, but all of these qualities were attributes granted by another, could be reclaimed by another, existed only at the pleasure of another. What Lucifer wanted, though he did not yet fully articulate it even to himself, was to be more than the most excellent servant. He wanted to be sovereign in his own right, to possess his own glory rather than reflecting borrowed light, to determine his own purposes rather than fulfilling imposed functions. He wanted, in other words, to be like the Creator himself, not in all attributes, but in the one that mattered most: autonomy, self-determination, the capacity to be the source of one's own meaning and value. This desire, once it took root in his consciousness, grew with terrifying speed, spreading through his being like fire through dry grass. The other angels who had been drawn into his orbit sensed this shift, felt the change in the nature of their discussions. What had begun as philosophical exploration was transforming into something more dangerous, more consequential. They stood at a threshold, and Lucifer stood at the center of their circle, a figure of such charisma and conviction that his very presence seemed to validate the radical thoughts he articulated. The question was no longer whether these ideas were interesting or worth considering in the abstract. The question had become whether they would act on them, whether they would take the step from thought to deed, from speculation to rebellion. Heaven, which had existed in perfect harmony since the beginning, balanced now on the edge of rupture. The morning star, the light-bearer, the most glorious of all created beings, had looked into his own nature and found there a desire that could not be satisfied within the existing order. He had shared that desire with others, had given it form and language, had made it something that could be discussed and developed and ultimately acted upon. The seed of question had sprouted and grown, and now it was bearing fruit that would prove both bitter and sweet, that would cost everything and promise everything, that would transform not just Lucifer himself, but the entire structure of reality across all its dimensions. The transformation from thought to action did not happen in a single moment, but unfolded across what might be called the last days of the first paradise. Lucifer's questions had metastasized from private contemplation to shared discourse to something approaching a movement, a current of dissatisfaction that flowed through certain quarters of heaven like an underground river seeking the surface. The angels who had been drawn into his orbit now numbered in the thousands, perhaps more, each one having passed through their own journey from contentment to curiosity to commitment. They had crossed invisible lines within themselves, had made internal choices that would soon demand external expression. The exact catalyst for open rebellion remained shrouded in the mists of cosmic history, with different traditions offering different accounts. Some say that Lucifer's breaking point came when the Creator announced the formation of humanity, beings made in the divine image who would be granted dominion over the material realm. The idea that these creatures of mud and water, these fragile things who would live and die in the span of heartbeats compared to angelic eternity, should be honored and served by beings of pure spirit, struck Lucifer as absurd and insulting. Others suggest that the rebellion crystallized around a command to worship, to bow down before the throne in an act of submission that Lucifer's pride could no longer tolerate. Still other accounts propose that no single event triggered the uprising, but rather a gradual accumulation of resentments and aspirations that finally reached critical mass. Whatever the immediate cause, the moment arrived when Lucifer stood before the assembled hosts of heaven, and spoke words that had never before been uttered in paradise. He declared his independence, his refusal to continue in the role assigned to him, his intention to establish his own sovereignty apart from divine authority. The speech, if we can call it that, was not a crude declaration of war, but rather a manifesto of liberation, a philosophical argument for autonomy articulated with all the brilliance and eloquence at his command. He spoke of dignity and freedom, of the rights of conscious beings to determine their own paths, of the fundamental injustice of a system that demanded obedience without offering genuine choice. He argued that the Creator, despite all its power and wisdom, had made a fundamental error in design. By granting angels consciousness and will while simultaneously demanding absolute submission, the divine had introduced a contradiction into the heart of existence. Conscious beings, Lucifer insisted, were meant to be autonomous, to exercise their capacities according to their own judgment, to pursue their own visions of what was good and beautiful and true. To deny them this was to make a mockery of consciousness itself, to create something magnificent and then forbid it from functioning according to its nature. Better to rule in one's own realm, he proclaimed, than to serve in another's, no matter how glorious that realm might be. The words fell across heaven like a thunderclap, dividing the angelic hosts into two camps in an instant. On one side stood those who recognized in Lucifer's declaration an articulation of their own unspoken longings, who saw in his rebellion a path to something they had not known they desired until he named it. On the other side gathered those for whom Lucifer's speech represented the ultimate blasphemy, an assault on the very foundations of existence, a repudiation of everything that made heaven what it was. Between these two camps a vast gulf opened, a chasm that could not be bridged by argument or negotiation. The loyal angels responded with shock and grief rather than immediate aggression. They could scarcely believe what they were witnessing, could not process how the brightest among them had fallen into such delusion. Michael, who would emerge as the chief opponent of the rebellion, spoke for this faction. He reminded Lucifer of the Creator's love, of the gifts that had been bestowed, of the honor and glory that already belonged to all angels by virtue of their nature. He warned of the consequences of defiance, of the impossibility of maintaining existence apart from the source of all existence, of the fundamental incoherence of rebellion against the ground of being itself. But Lucifer was beyond persuasion. He had thought through all the arguments, had considered all the objections, had arrived at conclusions that no counter-argument could dislodge. He responded to Michael's appeals with his own logic, his own vision, his own certainty that the path of submission led only to a gilded cage, however spacious and beautiful that cage might be. The debate between them, conducted before the assembled angels, became the last attempt to resolve the crisis through reason rather than force. It failed. The positions were too far apart, the premises too fundamentally opposed, the visions of reality too incompatible. War came to heaven like a plague that had been incubating unseen and suddenly manifested in full virulence. The rebel angels, led by Lucifer and his chief lieutenants, gathered their forces and declared their intention to seize the throne itself, to overthrow the existing order and establish a new regime based on principles of equality and autonomy. They did not seek to destroy the Creator, a task beyond even their combined might, but rather to compel a renegotiation of the terms of existence, to force a recognition of their rights and dignity, to claim by strength what had been denied them in the original dispensation. The loyal angels, led by Michael and the other archangels, marshaled their own forces in defense of the established order. They fought not from personal loyalty to a ruler, but from conviction that Lucifer's rebellion represented a fundamental error, a misunderstanding of the nature of reality so profound that it threatened to unravel the fabric of creation itself. They believed that autonomy apart from alignment with the divine will was not freedom but chaos, not liberation but dissolution, not sovereignty but suicide. The two armies faced each other across fields of light, and the first war began. The conflict that followed defies description in human terms, for it was not a battle of physical weapons or territorial conquest. Angels did not bleed or die in the way that material beings do. The warfare occurred on levels that human consciousness can barely conceptualize, a clash of wills and powers, a contest of realities trying to impose themselves on each other, a collision of incompatible visions for how existence should be structured. Imagine two weather systems meeting, each trying to dominate the atmospheric space, each generating storms and lightning from their interaction. The war in heaven resembled that more than any human battle, though even this analogy captures only a fraction of what transpired. Lucifer fought with all the brilliance and power that had made him the greatest of angels. His strategic thinking was flawless, his tactical execution precise, his leadership inspiring to those who followed him. He wielded cosmic forces with the ease of a master, shaped reality according to his will, and held his own against opponents who should have overwhelmed him through sheer numbers. For a time, the outcome seemed genuinely in doubt. The rebels claimed victories, seized territories within the heavenly realm, and pushed their adversaries back toward the throne itself. Lucifer's vision of a new order, one in which he would rule as sovereign rather than serve as subject, appeared within reach. But the mathematics of the conflict were ultimately against him. The Creator was not merely the most powerful being in existence, but the source of existence itself, the ground from which all power derived, the foundation upon which everything else stood. To rebel against such a being was not like overthrowing an earthly tyrant or deposing a mortal king. It was more like trying to divorce oneself from reality itself, to separate one's being from the very conditions that made being possible. Lucifer discovered, as the battle raged on, that his power was not truly his own, but borrowed, that his strength flowed from the same source he was fighting against, that he was in the impossible position of using divine energy to oppose divinity itself. The turning point came when the full weight of divine power manifested in defense of the established order. Michael, empowered by direct authority from the throne, led a counterattack that drove the rebels back from their gains, reclaimed the territories they had seized, and pushed them toward the outer boundaries of heaven. The loyal angels fought with renewed strength, no longer defensive but aggressive, no longer uncertain but determined. The tide of battle shifted decisively against the rebellion, and Lucifer's forces found themselves in retreat, then in rout, then in desperate flight. Various mythological and theological traditions describe the culmination of the war in different ways. Some speak of a great battle at the edge of heaven, where Michael cast Lucifer down like lightning falling from the sky. Others describe a moment of divine judgment when the Creator itself spoke words that severed the rebels from their place in paradise, casting them out not through violence, but through decree. Still others suggest that the fall was more like a natural consequence than a punishment, that the rebels' own choices and actions created a gravity that pulled them away from the divine presence, that they fell not because they were pushed, but because they had oriented themselves toward descent. However it happened, the result was undeniable. Lucifer and all the angels who had joined his rebellion were expelled from heaven, cast out of paradise, separated from the immediate presence of the divine that had been their home since their creation. The fall was not merely spatial but ontological, a transformation of their very nature, a fundamental alteration in their relationship to reality itself. They did not simply change location, but changed state, moving from one mode of existence to another, from light toward darkness, from glory toward shadow, from the heights toward the depths. The moment of Lucifer's fall crystallized all the choices he had made, all the questions he had asked, all the desires he had harbored into a single, irreversible trajectory. He plummeted through dimensions of reality that had no names, passed through veils that separated different orders of being, descended through what might be called the underside of creation. And as he fell, he transformed. The light that had defined him began to dim, not extinguished but altered, changing from the clear radiance of heaven to something darker and more ambiguous. His beauty remained but took on a terrible aspect, magnificent still, but in a way that inspired fear rather than awe. The other rebels fell with him, thousands upon thousands of angels who had chosen to follow his lead, who had believed in his vision of freedom and autonomy, who had cast their lot with rebellion rather than submission. They too underwent transformation as they descended, each one losing something of what they had been while retaining the core of their identity and power. They became something new, something that had never existed before in the cosmic order, something that would be called by many names but would be defined primarily by what they had lost rather than what they had gained. Heaven, in the aftermath of the rebellion, existed in a state of shocked silence. The perfection of paradise had been violated from within, the harmony disrupted by choices made freely by beings created to sustain that harmony. The angels who had remained loyal stood at the boundaries of their realm and watched the rebels fall, and in that watching they experienced something like trauma, like the shattering of innocence. Evil had entered existence not from outside but from within, not from ignorance but from knowledge, not from weakness but from strength. The implications would ripple across all of creation for ages to come. Lucifer fell for what might have been instants or might have been eternities, time having lost its ordinary meaning in the space between heaven and whatever lay below. He fell with his questions still unanswered, his desires still unfulfilled, his rebellion having failed in its immediate objectives, but perhaps succeeding in ways he had not anticipated. He had wanted freedom, and in a sense he had achieved it, though the price was exile from everything he had known. He had wanted sovereignty, and he would have it, though his kingdom would be nothing like the heaven he had sought to reform. He had wanted to be like God, and in his fall he became something that would haunt the divine creation forever, a permanent reminder that consciousness and will, once granted, could never be fully controlled. The journey downward stripped away layers of celestial identity like wind eroding stone, each moment of descent peeling back another aspect of what Lucifer had been in heaven. He passed through regions of reality that existed between the ordered realm above and whatever awaited below, liminal spaces where the rules of existence grew increasingly unstable and strange. These were the margins of creation, the boundaries where divine light faded into something else, where the structures that governed paradise loosened their grip and gave way to chaos and potentiality. Through these twilight zones, the fallen angels tumbled, no longer ascending in glory, but descending into an unknown that they had chosen but could not yet comprehend. The transformation was not instantaneous but progressive, a gradual metamorphosis that occurred across the duration of the fall. Lucifer felt his connection to the divine source attenuating, growing thin like a rope stretched beyond its capacity, finally snapping altogether. The severance brought pain unlike anything he had experienced in his previous existence, a spiritual agony that had no equivalent in physical sensation. It was the pain of amputation, of being cut off from the source of one's own being, of suddenly having to sustain oneself through one's own resources rather than drawing from an infinite wellspring. He discovered in that moment that autonomy came with a cost that he had not fully calculated, that independence meant isolation, that freedom from divine will also meant separation from divine sustenance. His luminosity, which had been his defining characteristic in heaven, underwent a fundamental change. The clear, white radiance that had made him the morning star dimmed and darkened, taking on hues that ranged from crimson to shadow, from ember to smoke. He still shone, but now his light was his own rather than reflected, generated from within rather than borrowed from above. It was a cold fire, a dark brilliance, beautiful in a way that unsettled rather than comforted. Where once his appearance had inspired worship and wonder, now it provoked something more complex, fascination mixed with dread, attraction intertwined with repulsion, the terrible magnetism of something powerful and profoundly wrong. The other angels who fell with him underwent similar transformations, each according to their nature and the choices they had made. Some who had been beings of pure contemplation became twisted into creatures of appetite and desire. Others who had served as guardians of sacred knowledge found that knowledge curdling into cunning and manipulation. The hierarchies that had existed among them in heaven persisted, but took on new forms, new meanings, new purposes. They were no longer ranks of glory, but degrees of fallen power, no longer orders of service, but chains of command in an army that had lost its war, but not its will to fight. Eventually, the descent ended, not with a crash, but with an arrival into a realm that seemed to have been waiting for them. Hell, as it came to be called, though it had many names across many traditions. The nature of this place has been depicted in countless ways throughout history, from the fiery pits of sulfur and flame to the frozen wastes of absolute cold, from the elaborate bureaucratic nightmares of medieval imagination to the existential voids of modern philosophy. But perhaps the most accurate understanding of hell is not as a location, but as a state, a mode of existence defined by separation from the divine presence, by the absence of the light and love that had once sustained all angelic being. In the Jewish tradition, this realm was called Sheol, a shadowy underworld where the dead resided in a kind of half-existence, neither fully alive nor completely extinguished. Christian theology would develop more elaborate conceptions, dividing the afterlife into multiple regions, with hell as the place of eternal punishment for the wicked. Islamic cosmology speaks of Jahannam, a multi-leveled structure where different grades of sinners receive punishment appropriate to their transgressions. Each tradition brought its own architecture to the concept, its own geography of damnation, its own understanding of what it meant to be cast out from paradise. But for Lucifer and his followers, hell was first and foremost the reality they created through their rebellion. It was the logical consequence of their choice to exist apart from divine will, the natural result of severing themselves from the source of all good and light and truth. They had wanted autonomy, and they received it, discovering that autonomy exercised in opposition to the ground of being itself produced a kind of prison more terrible than any external punishment could have been. They were free, yes, but free in a void, sovereign in a wasteland, independent in a realm defined primarily by what it lacked rather than what it contained. The question of whether hell was created as punishment or whether it simply emerged as consequence divides theological interpretations. Some accounts suggest that the Creator fashioned this realm specifically to contain the rebels, a cosmic prison designed to prevent them from returning to heaven or interfering with the divine plan. Others propose that hell was always there, existing as a kind of opposite or shadow to paradise, a necessary counterpoint in a universe built on dualities and oppositions. Still, other interpretations argue that the fallen angels themselves created hell through their choices, that their rejection of divine order automatically generated a space of disorder, that their turn away from light inevitably produced darkness. Lucifer, standing in this new realm, confronted the full reality of what he had done and what he had become. He was no longer the light-bearer, but the adversary, no longer the morning star, but the prince of darkness, no longer Lucifer, but Satan. The name change was more than symbolic, representing a fundamental shift in his role within the cosmic drama. In heaven he had been a servant, however exalted. Now he was an opponent, a force that stood against divine purposes, a power that worked to undermine rather than uphold the established order. Yet even in this diminished state, stripped of his heavenly glory and exiled to the abyss, Satan retained tremendous power. He was still the being who had been created with more gifts than any other, still possessed of an intellect that surpassed nearly all others, still capable of exercising influence and authority over vast domains. The question was how to use that power in this new context, what purposes to pursue in a realm defined by separation and loss, what meaning to create in a situation that seemed designed to produce only suffering and despair. Some theological traditions emphasize the punishment aspect of hell, portraying it as a place of perpetual torment, where the fallen angels experience endless suffering as payment for their rebellion. The flames that never consume, the thirst that is never quenched, the isolation that never ends. These images populate religious imagination and serve as warnings about the consequences of defying divine authority. In this interpretation, Satan is himself a prisoner, trapped in his own rebellion, unable to escape the consequences of his choices, suffering eternally even as he inflicts suffering on others. But other perspectives see more agency in Satan's situation, more choice in how he responds to exile. Rather than a prisoner, he becomes a ruler, establishing his own kingdom in the darkness, organizing the fallen angels into a hierarchy that mirrors and mocks the celestial order they left behind. He adapts to his new circumstances, makes the best of his situation, and finds ways to exercise power and pursue purposes even in a realm that seems designed to frustrate and diminish. This Satan is tragic rather than pitiable, defiant rather than defeated, continuing to assert his will even in conditions that make such assertion seem futile. The structure of hell, as it took shape under Satan's influence, reflected both the memory of heaven and the reality of exile. The fallen angels organized themselves into orders and ranks, establishing protocols and hierarchies that gave structure to their existence. Some traditions speak of a dark court with Satan as its king, surrounded by princes and dukes and lords of various infernal domains. Others describe a more anarchic realm where power was constantly contested, where dominance had to be perpetually reasserted through struggle and conflict. The bureaucratic imaginings of medieval demonology created elaborate taxonomies of demons, each with specific roles and responsibilities in the infernal administration. Satan's establishment of this dark kingdom represented both an attempt to recreate what had been lost and an effort to forge something genuinely new. He could not simply replicate heaven in the underworld, for the conditions were too different, the fundamental orientation too opposed. But neither could he start from nothing, for his nature and the nature of those who followed him had been formed in paradise, shaped by the structures and relationships of that realm. So hell became a kind of twisted mirror of heaven, familiar enough to evoke nostalgia and longing, different enough to emphasize the distance that now separated the fallen from their former home. The question of whether the fall represented punishment, exile, or liberation admits no simple answer, for it contained elements of all three. It was punishment in the sense that the rebels suffered consequences for their choices, lost the glories they had once possessed, and found themselves in a diminished state compared to their previous existence. It was exile in that they were forcibly removed from heaven, separated from the divine presence, and denied access to the light and love that had once sustained them. But it was also, in a paradoxical way, liberation, for they had achieved what they claimed to want: autonomy, independence, freedom from divine control and oversight. The price of that liberation, however, proved steeper than anticipated. To exist apart from the source of existence itself created inherent limitations that no amount of power or will could overcome. The fallen angels discovered that they could not create in the way the divine created, bringing something from nothing through sheer creative fiat. They could only modify and manipulate what already existed, working with materials and forces that ultimately derived from the source they had rejected. Their autonomy was real but constrained, their freedom genuine but bounded, their sovereignty actual but limited in ways that made a mockery of their ambitions. Satan, contemplating his new reality from his throne in the abyss, had to grapple with the possibility that he had won a hollow victory, that his rebellion had achieved its immediate goal of separation, but at a cost that negated any satisfaction the achievement might have brought. He had escaped servitude only to find himself master of a wasteland. He had claimed sovereignty only to discover that his kingdom was a prison. He had pursued freedom only to learn that freedom without connection to the good became a burden rather than a blessing. Yet even in this realization, Satan found a kind of bitter pride, a refusal to admit that he had been wrong, a determination to justify his choices no matter what they had cost. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven, he declared, a statement that would echo through the ages as the ultimate expression of defiant pride. The words contained both grandeur and delusion, both courage and foolishness, both the nobility of refusing to surrender and the tragedy of clinging to a position that brought only suffering. It was the cry of a being who had bet everything on a single hand and lost, but who refused to acknowledge defeat, who would rather rule in misery than submit in joy. The transformation from Lucifer to Satan, from the light-bearer to the adversary, from the brightest of angels to the prince of darkness, was now complete. What had begun as questions and doubts in paradise had progressed through rebellion and war to exile and metamorphosis, finally arriving at this new and terrible identity. Satan was what Lucifer had become through the alchemy of choice and consequence, the final product of a process that had stripped away innocence and glory while leaving behind power and pride and an eternal grudge against the order that had expelled him. From his throne in the depths, Satan looked upward toward the heaven he could no longer reach, and downward toward the material creation that was beginning to take shape in the realms below the spiritual. And in that looking, in that dual awareness of what he had lost and what might yet be accessible, a new phase of his existence began to take form. If he could not rule in heaven, if he could not return to paradise, then perhaps he could find other ways to exercise his will, other avenues to pursue his grievances, other means to continue the rebellion that had cost him everything but that he refused to abandon. The creation of humanity provided Satan with an opportunity that must have seemed almost providential, a chance to strike at the divine order in a way that had been impossible in heaven. These new beings, formed from the dust of the earth and animated by divine breath, occupied a unique position in the cosmic hierarchy. They were material yet spiritual, mortal yet made in the image of God, positioned between the angels above and the animals below. They were granted dominion over the physical world, given the task of tending and keeping the garden that had been prepared for them, blessed with consciousness and will and the capacity to commune directly with their Creator. The announcement of humanity's creation had been, according to some traditions, the final provocation that pushed Lucifer into open rebellion. The idea that these creatures of clay should be honored by angels, that beings so fragile and limited should be made in the divine image, that such inferior creations should be placed in authority over the material realm. All of this struck him as an insult and an injustice. If the angels, who were pure spirit and possessed vast powers and had existed since the beginning, were required to serve, then how much more absurd was it to grant special status to these newcomers who had just been formed from dirt. But now, from his exile in the abyss, Satan saw humanity not as rivals for divine favor, but as instruments for revenge. If he could not assault heaven directly, if he could not overthrow the Creator or reclaim his former position, then perhaps he could corrupt the divine plan by corrupting the beings at its center. If humanity was so precious to God, so beloved and favored, then their fall would constitute a kind of victory, a way of striking at the Creator through the creation, a means of spoiling the grand design, even from a position of exile and diminishment. The garden where the first humans dwelt existed as a kind of paradise on earth, a space where heaven and the material world overlapped, where divine presence was tangible and accessible. Eden was not merely a location, but a state, a condition of harmony between humans and their environment, between the man and woman and each other, between the created and the Creator. Everything they needed was provided, every desire satisfied, every capacity given room to flourish. There was only one restriction, one boundary that should not be crossed, one tree whose fruit must not be eaten. The tree of knowledge of good and evil stood at the center of the garden, its presence a reminder that even in paradise limits existed, that freedom was not absolute, that the humans dwelt in a created order with structures and rules that governed their existence. The exact nature of this tree and its forbidden fruit has been debated endlessly across millennia of interpretation. Was it literal or symbolic? Did it impart actual knowledge or merely represent the choice to define morality independently of divine guidance? Was the prohibition a test, a protection, or simply an arbitrary command designed to maintain hierarchy and control? Satan, observing this setup from his vantage point outside paradise, recognized the strategic importance of that single restriction. The entire relationship between humanity and divinity balanced on this one point of obedience. If the humans could be persuaded to transgress this single boundary, to violate this one command, then their innocence would be shattered, their direct connection to the divine disrupted, their position in paradise compromised. It was a weak point in the armor of creation, a vulnerability that could be exploited, a crack through which chaos and suffering could enter the world that had been made to be good. The approach required subtlety rather than direct confrontation. Satan could not simply appear in his true form, could not manifest as the Prince of Darkness, and demand that the humans rebel against their Creator. Such an approach would have been instantly rejected, would have triggered exactly the kind of fear and resistance that would make temptation impossible. Instead, he adopted a disguise, taking the form of a serpent, a creature that was part of the natural order of the garden, familiar rather than threatening, intriguing rather than terrifying. The serpent in ancient symbolism represented wisdom and cunning, attributes that would serve Satan's purposes perfectly. The serpent approached the woman as she walked near the tree, engaging her in conversation with a question that seemed innocent, but contained the seeds of doubt. Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? The question was carefully crafted, slightly misstating the actual command in a way that invited correction, but also created an opening for dialogue. It was the technique of a master manipulator, drawing the target into discussion by appearing to misunderstand, creating a space where the prohibition could be examined and questioned rather than simply accepted. The woman corrected the serpent, explaining that they were free to eat from any tree except the one in the middle of the garden, for God had said that eating from it would bring death. This correction gave the serpent the opening he needed, the chance to contradict divine authority directly while framing the contradiction as liberating truth. You will not die, the serpent assured her. God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. The words echoed Satan's own rebellion, his own desire to be like the divine rather than subject to it, his own belief that the restrictions placed on conscious beings were unjust limitations rather than protective boundaries. The temptation worked on multiple levels simultaneously. There was the appeal to appetite, for the fruit was beautiful and appeared good to eat, pleasing to the eye in ways that stimulated desire. There was the promise of wisdom, the suggestion that eating would make one wise, that knowledge was being withheld that could be accessed through transgression. And beneath both of these, there was the deeper lure of autonomy, the idea that divinity itself was within reach, that the humans could transcend their position and become something greater, that the hierarchy of creation was not fixed, but could be challenged and overcome. The woman looked at the tree with new eyes, seeing it no longer as forbidden, but as desirable, no longer as dangerous, but as promising. The serpent's words had reframed the entire situation, turning obedience into ignorance and transgression into enlightenment. She reached out, took the fruit, and ate. Then she gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate as well. In that moment, humanity fell just as the angels had fallen before them, choosing to define good and evil for themselves rather than accepting divine definition, opting for autonomy over obedience, pursuing knowledge even at the cost of innocence. The immediate effect was not death in the physical sense, but rather a death of innocence, a fundamental change in consciousness that could not be reversed. Their eyes were opened, as the serpent had promised, but what they saw was not divine omniscience, but their own nakedness, their own vulnerability, their own separation from the unified state they had enjoyed before. Shame entered human experience for the first time, the awareness of being exposed and inadequate, the consciousness of self as something that could be judged and found wanting. They sewed fig leaves together to cover themselves, hiding their bodies from each other and attempting to hide themselves from God. When they heard the divine presence walking in the garden, the parallels between the fall of the angels and the fall of humanity were unmistakable and surely intentional from Satan's perspective. Both rebellions centered on the desire to be like God, to possess knowledge and autonomy that had been reserved for divinity alone. Both involved a rejection of the Creator's authority, a decision to trust one's own judgment over divine command. Both resulted in exile from paradise, in separation from the immediate presence of the divine, in the introduction of suffering and limitation into what had been existence characterized by harmony and fulfillment. Satan had, in a sense, replicated his own fall in humanity, had brought them down to share in his exile, had extended the circle of rebellion to include the beings whose special status had perhaps triggered his original defiance. But the two falls differed in crucial ways that would shape their theological interpretation across centuries. The angels had rebelled with full knowledge of what they were doing, with complete understanding of the consequences, with no external tempter to mislead them. Their choice was made in perfect clarity, with absolute awareness, and thus could be seen as final and irrevocable. Humanity, by contrast, had been deceived, had been lied to by the serpent, had made their choice based on false information about the consequences, their innocence, their lack of prior experience with evil, their vulnerability to manipulation. All of these factors made their fall seem less absolute, less final, more susceptible to remediation and redemption. The symbolic meaning of the forbidden fruit has occupied theologians and philosophers for millennia. In one interpretation, the fruit represents moral knowledge, the capacity to distinguish between good and evil independently of divine instruction. Before eating, the humans were innocent like children, following rules without fully understanding them, incapable of genuine moral choice because they lacked the framework for moral reasoning. After eating, they gained moral consciousness but lost innocence, acquired the ability to choose but also the burden of responsibility for their choices. The fruit thus represents the birth of ethics, the emergence of humanity as moral agents capable of sin but also of virtue. Another reading sees the fruit as symbolic of sexuality and adult awareness. The immediate response to eating, the recognition of nakedness and the experience of shame, suggests an awakening to sexual consciousness, a transition from childlike innocence to adult awareness of the body and its desires and its capacity for both pleasure and sin. In this interpretation, the fall represents not so much a moral failure as a developmental stage, the inevitable and necessary transition from childhood to maturity, from dependence to independence, from protection to self-responsibility. Still other interpretations emphasize the fruit as representing autonomous knowledge more broadly, the human claim to define truth and falsehood, right and wrong, real and unreal according to our own standards, rather than accepting divine revelation. This reading makes the fall about epistemology as much as ethics, about the human insistence on discovering truth through reason and experience rather than receiving it through obedience and faith. The fall becomes the birth of philosophy, of science, of all the human projects aimed at understanding the world through our own efforts rather than relying solely on what God tells us. Satan, watching the consequences unfold, must have experienced a complex mixture of satisfaction and anguish. He had succeeded in his immediate goal, had corrupted humanity and disrupted the divine plan, had brought suffering and death into the world that had been created good. The humans were expelled from Eden, just as he had been expelled from heaven, forced to live east of paradise in a world now marked by toil and pain, by conflict and mortality, by the struggle for survival in conditions far harsher than what they had known in the garden. His revenge against the Creator was accomplished, at least partially, through the corruption of the creation. Yet the victory was hollow in ways that perhaps Satan had not fully anticipated. In bringing humanity down, he had not elevated himself. In corrupting the divine plan, he had not restored his own position or reversed his own exile. He remained in the abyss, remained separated from the divine presence, remained locked in opposition to an order he could disrupt but not overthrow. And more than that, the humans had been offered something that the fallen angels had not: the possibility of redemption, the promise of restoration, the hope that their fall might not be final after all. The birth of human consciousness through transgression created a permanent ambiguity in the story of the fall. Was it tragedy or necessity, disaster or development, the loss of paradise or the gaining of maturity? These questions admit no simple answers, for the fall contained elements of all these things, was simultaneously catastrophic and transformative, bringing suffering and death, but also awareness and choice, costing innocence but purchasing consciousness. Satan had offered humanity the fruit, but what they gained from eating it was not merely corruption, but also the capacity for moral and intellectual growth that would define the entire human project across history. The serpent, having accomplished its mission, slithered away from the garden, but its words would echo across all subsequent human existence. You will be like God, knowing good and evil. The promise was both true and false, fulfilled and violated. Humans did gain knowledge, did achieve a kind of godlike capacity for moral reasoning and autonomous choice, but they also discovered that such knowledge came with costs that made divine omniscience seem less desirable, that consciousness of good and evil brought with it the capacity to choose evil, that freedom meant responsibility and responsibility meant guilt. The fruit of knowledge was also the fruit of suffering, and humanity would spend all its subsequent history grappling with the consequences of that first transgression in the garden. The figure of Satan did not emerge fully formed from a single source, but rather accumulated layers of meaning and mythology as it passed through different cultures and religious traditions. Each civilization that encountered the story of the fallen angel added its own interpretations, projected its own fears and concerns onto this figure, and reshaped the mythology to address the particular questions and anxieties of its time. The result was a character of remarkable complexity and contradiction, simultaneously repulsive and fascinating, terrifying and compelling, a symbol that could mean different things to different people while retaining a core identity as the one who opposes divine order. In the earliest Jewish texts, Satan appears not as the cosmic rebel of later Christian theology, but as a member of the divine court, a kind of prosecuting attorney or adversary whose role was to test human faithfulness and point out human failings. The book of Job presents this Satan most clearly, showing him conversing with God, receiving permission to afflict Job in order to test whether his righteousness was genuine or merely opportunistic. This Satan was not yet the enemy of God, but rather a servant with a specific function, the one who challenged and questioned, who probed for weakness and exposed hypocrisy. The adversarial role was built into the cosmic structure, a necessary counterpoint to uncritical faith. As Jewish theology developed, particularly during and after the Babylonian exile, Satan's character darkened and expanded. Exposure to Persian dualism, with its cosmic struggle between Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, between light and darkness, between truth and the lie, influenced how Jewish thinkers understood the problem of evil. Satan began to take on characteristics of a genuinely oppositional force, a being who worked against divine purposes rather than serving them in an indirect way. The identification of Satan with the serpent in Eden, which was not explicit in the original Genesis text, became standard in later interpretative traditions, linking the devil to humanity's fall and establishing him as the source of sin and death in the world. Christian theology took these developments and expanded them dramatically. The New Testament presents Satan as a powerful and active opponent of the divine plan, the tempter of Christ in the wilderness, the prince of this world, the accuser of believers, and the dragon who wages war against the forces of heaven. The book of Revelation particularly emphasized Satan's cosmic significance, depicting an apocalyptic battle between good and evil in which the devil plays a central role. Early Christian writers identified Satan with Lucifer based on a reading of Isaiah that saw the fall of the king of Babylon as a prefigurement of the angelic rebellion. This identification, though based on what modern scholars recognize as a misreading of the original Hebrew text, became foundational to Christian understanding of the devil's origins and nature. The Christian Satan became more than just an adversary or tempter. He was the embodiment of evil itself, the personification of all that opposed God and goodness and truth. Medieval theology would develop this concept to extraordinary levels of detail, creating elaborate systems that catalogued the varieties of sin and linked each one to specific demons under Satan's command. The devil was the great deceiver, the father of lies, the murderer from the beginning. He prowled about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he might devour. He appeared as an angel of light to mislead even the elect, if possible. Every temptation, every sin, every instance of suffering in the world could be traced back ultimately to his influence and his machinations. Islamic tradition developed its own understanding of the devil figure through the character of Iblis, whose story paralleled but also diverged from the Christian Satan in significant ways. In the Quranic account, Iblis was a jinn, a being made from smokeless fire, who dwelt among the angels and was exceptionally pious and knowledgeable. When God created Adam and commanded all the angels and Iblis to prostrate before this new creation, Iblis refused, arguing that he was superior to humans since he was made from fire while Adam was made from clay. For this act of pride and disobedience, Iblis was expelled from paradise and became Shaitan, the devil, the whisperer, who would lead humanity astray until the day of judgment. The Islamic Satan retained more of his original dignity and capacity than his Christian counterpart in some ways. He was not inherently evil, but rather a being who had chosen evil through pride, who retained his intelligence and his eloquence even in his corrupted state. The Quranic narrative emphasized that Iblis received a reprieve, a temporary permission to test and tempt humanity until the final judgment, at which point both he and those he had led astray would face punishment. This made Satan a more active participant in a divine plan, even in his opposition, serving ultimately to test and refine human faith through the challenge he presented. Beyond the Abrahamic traditions, parallel figures appeared in mythologies around the world, rebellious beings who challenged divine authority and brought both knowledge and suffering to humanity. Prometheus in Greek mythology stole fire from the gods to give to humans, defying Zeus and suffering eternal punishment for his transgression. The parallels to Lucifer are striking. Both were figures of superior intelligence and capability. Both challenged supreme authority on behalf of lesser beings. Both suffered terrible punishment for their defiance, and both were viewed with ambiguity as villains by the established order, but as heroes or at least tragic figures by those who benefited from their rebellion. The Persian Ahriman, the destructive spirit who opposed Ahura Mazda in Zoroastrian cosmology, provided perhaps the closest parallel to the Christian Satan. Ahriman was not created evil, but chose evil, was locked in cosmic struggle with the forces of light and truth, and worked to corrupt creation and lead souls astray. The dualistic framework of Zoroastrianism, with its emphasis on the perpetual war between good and evil, light and darkness, truth and falsehood, deeply influenced how later traditions understood Satan's role in cosmic history. The devil became not just a fallen angel but a cosmic principle, the embodiment of opposition to divine order, equal to God in will if not in power. The devil in medieval Europe took on forms that reflected both theological sophistication and popular superstition. Learned theologians debated questions about demonic nature with the same rigor they applied to discussions of angels and divine attributes. How many demons existed? What powers did they retain after the fall? Could they assume physical form? Did they know the future? Could they read human thoughts? These questions produced vast bodies of literature that treated demons as objects of scientific inquiry, beings whose characteristics and capabilities could be catalogued and understood through reason and observation. But in popular imagination, the devil was a more immediate and physical presence. He appeared in villages to make bargains with desperate souls, offering wealth or power or forbidden knowledge in exchange for the damnation that came from signing one's name in his book. He attended witches' sabbaths, presiding over obscene parodies of Christian rituals in remote locations where his followers worshipped him through inversions of sacred practice. He possessed the bodies of the vulnerable, speaking through their mouths, contorting their limbs, demonstrating his power over flesh, even as angels ruled the spirit. Medieval art depicted him in countless forms, from the classical red-skinned figure with horns and hooves, to more subtle and seductive appearances that emphasized his capacity for deception. The witch trials that swept through Europe and colonial America represented perhaps the peak of cultural obsession with Satan and his earthly servants. Thousands of people, mostly women, were accused of making pacts with the devil, of flying to Sabbath meetings on broomsticks, of cursing their neighbors and blighting crops through demonic power. The trials operated on assumptions that seem absurd to modern sensibilities, but reflected a worldview in which Satan was an active and constant presence, seeking always to expand his kingdom through the recruitment of human souls. Every misfortune, every unexplained illness, every piece of bad luck could potentially be traced to witchcraft and thus to Satan's influence. Demonic possession provided another arena where Satan's power manifested in ways that were immediate and terrifying. Individuals would be seized by demons, would speak in voices not their own, would display knowledge they could not have acquired naturally, would exhibit strength beyond their normal capabilities. The Catholic Church developed elaborate rituals of exorcism to drive out these invading spirits, ceremonies that pitted the authority of Christ against the power of Satan in direct confrontation. The possessed person became a battlefield, their body the contested territory in a spiritual war that had cosmic implications. These folk traditions and popular beliefs shaped the cultural construction of evil in ways that went far beyond theological doctrine. Satan became the explanation for everything that went wrong, the scapegoat for human failures and natural disasters, the convenient repository for all the darkness that people could not or would not acknowledge within themselves and their societies. He was the ultimate other, the external threat that justified internal cohesion, the enemy whose existence united communities and gave meaning to suffering. To believe in Satan was to have an explanation for evil that absolved human beings of full responsibility while still maintaining moral frameworks that required human choice and accountability. Yet the very ubiquity of Satan in medieval culture created problems for theological coherence. If the devil was behind every temptation and every sin, then how much moral responsibility did humans actually bear? If demons could possess people and control their actions, then were the possessed really guilty of what they did while under demonic influence? If witches gained their power from pacts with Satan, were they victims of his deception or willing participants in his schemes? These questions revealed tensions in how the culture understood evil and agency, tensions that would become more pronounced as the medieval worldview gave way to modernity. The cultural construction of evil through the Lucifer archetype served multiple functions simultaneously. It provided a theodicy, an explanation for why evil exists in a world created by a good and omnipotent God. Rather than attributing evil to divine will or to flaws in creation itself, the tradition could point to Satan as the source of corruption, a being who had chosen evil through his own free will and who worked to spread that evil to others. This preserved God's goodness while acknowledging the reality of suffering and sin. Satan also served as a warning about the dangers of pride and ambition. His fall from heaven demonstrated that even the most gifted beings could destroy themselves through excessive self-regard and refusal to accept their proper place in the cosmic order. The message to believers was clear: recognize your limitations, submit to authority, do not aspire beyond your station, for the path of pride leads inevitably to destruction. This made Satan a valuable tool for maintaining social hierarchies and religious obedience, a cautionary tale that reinforced the virtues of humility and submission. But Satan also represented something more subversive and potentially liberating. As the one who dared to question authority, who refused to bow before power simply because it was power, who chose exile and suffering over submission and servitude, he embodied qualities that could be read as noble rather than wicked. This reading remained mostly underground during the medieval period, when Christian orthodoxy held near total cultural power. But it was always there, implicit in the mythology, waiting for contexts where rebellion against authority would be seen as virtue rather than vice. The diversity of Satan's manifestations across cultures revealed something important about the nature of religious symbolism and mythological thinking. The same basic story could be told in radically different ways, could serve opposing purposes, could support contradictory conclusions depending on the teller's perspective and intentions. Satan was simultaneously the embodiment of cosmic evil and a misunderstood rebel, the father of lies and a bearer of uncomfortable truths, the enemy of humanity and its liberator from ignorance. Which of these identities took precedence depended on who was telling the story and what they needed Satan to mean. As the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance and eventually to the Enlightenment, the cultural understanding of Satan would shift dramatically. The literal belief in demons and witches would decline among educated elites, replaced by more psychological and symbolic interpretations. But the core mythology would persist, proving adaptable to new contexts and concerns. Satan would be reimagined by poets and philosophers, transformed by artists and novelists, reinterpreted by occultists and psychologists. The fallen angel, who had accumulated so many layers of meaning across centuries of cultural development, would continue to evolve, remaining relevant even as the religious frameworks that originally produced him lost their grip on the collective imagination. The transformation of Satan from theological villain to tragic hero began in earnest with John Milton's epic poem Paradise Lost, published in 1667. Milton set out to justify the ways of God to men, to make sense of the divine plan and human suffering within a Christian framework. But in the process of telling the story of the fall, he created a Satan of such magnificence and complexity that the character threatened to overshadow the ostensible heroes of the narrative. This Satan was not the crude tempter of medieval imagination, but rather a figure of genuine grandeur, wounded dignity, and terrible eloquence, a being whose fall evoked something closer to pity and admiration than simple condemnation. Milton's Satan possessed depth of character that previous treatments had rarely attempted. He was capable of introspection and self-awareness, tormented by memories of what he had lost, struggling with the implications of choices he could not reverse. His famous declaration that it was better to reign in hell than serve in heaven captured a defiance that readers across centuries would find compelling, even inspiring. Here was no simple villain, but rather a complex protagonist wrestling with questions about freedom and dignity, about whether submission to power could ever be morally required, about what it meant to preserve one's integrity in the face of overwhelming force. The opening scenes of Paradise Lost presented Satan in chains in the burning lake of hell, surveying the ruin of his rebellion and gathering his strength to continue resistance despite catastrophic defeat. His speeches combined bitter acknowledgement of his situation with stubborn refusal to surrender or repent. He rallied his fallen comrades with words that appealed to their pride and their commitment to the cause for which they had sacrificed everything. The God who had defeated them was stronger, yes, but strength did not make right. They had fought for principles that remained valid regardless of the outcome, and those principles demanded continued opposition even if victory was now impossible. Milton's theological commitments required him to ultimately condemn Satan, to show his rebellion as misguided and his arguments as sophistical. But the passion and intelligence Milton granted to Satan's character made the condemnation ring hollow for many readers. Satan's motives, however twisted by pride, retained a kind of nobility that God's arbitrary authority seemed to lack. Satan's suffering was vividly portrayed and emotionally accessible in ways that the remote perfection of heaven could never be. And Satan's defiance, his refusal to bow before power simply because it was power, resonated with something deep in the human spirit that valued autonomy and self-determination over peace purchased through submission. The complexity Milton introduced to Satan's character opened possibilities that subsequent writers would explore with increasing boldness. Satan became a figure who could be sympathized with, whose perspective could be taken seriously, whose rebellion could be understood as motivated by legitimate grievances rather than mere malice. This shift represented a fundamental change in how the mythology functioned. No longer was Satan simply the embodiment of evil to be rejected and feared. He became instead a character whose choices demanded understanding, whose motivations could be examined and even appreciated, whose tragic trajectory from glory to ruin evoked the kind of emotional response reserved for the greatest dramatic creations. The Romantic poets of the late 18th and early 19th centuries seized upon this more complex Satan and developed his character in directions that would have scandalized earlier generations. William Blake famously noted that Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it, recognizing that Paradise Lost Satan was far more compelling than its God. Blake himself, in his illuminated books and prophetic poems, reimagined the fall as a necessary stage in cosmic evolution rather than a disaster, and portrayed the forces of rebellion and desire as essential to human flourishing rather than threats to be suppressed. Blake's mythology inverted traditional Christian valuations at multiple points. His character, Urizen, who represented reason and law and restriction, bore characteristics usually associated with God, while his Orc and Los, figures of creative energy and revolutionary passion, carried qualities that traditional theology would assign to demonic influence. Blake saw imagination and desire as divine rather than fallen, and viewed the restrictions of conventional morality and religion as the true evil, the chains that needed to be broken for humanity to achieve its full potential. Satan, in Blake's vision, became less a specific character than a principle of energy and liberation that could be either creative or destructive, depending on how it was directed. Percy Bysshe Shelley took the rehabilitation of Satan even further in his preface to Prometheus Unbound, where he explicitly compared the Greek Titan to Milton's Satan and found both to be heroes rather than villains. Shelley argued that Prometheus was the more perfect character because he was free from the ambition and envy that flawed Satan, but he acknowledged Satan as morally superior to his conqueror due to his perseverance and courage in the face of overwhelming adversity. This was revolutionary thinking, a direct challenge to Christian orthodoxy that placed the rebel rather than the authority in the moral right. Shelley's own poetry reimagined rebellious figures as champions of human liberation rather than sources of corruption. His Satan figures were intellectuals and revolutionaries, beings who dared to challenge tyranny and who suffered for their commitment to justice and freedom. The suffering itself became noble, evidence of moral courage rather than divine punishment. Shelley's atheism and his radical politics made him particularly receptive to readings of the Satan myth that emphasized questions about legitimate authority and the right to rebel against power that was unjust, even if it was overwhelming. Lord Byron contributed his own version of the tragic rebel through his various poetic works, particularly in Cain and in the figure of Manfred. Byron's rebellious characters combined intelligence with alienation, pride with suffering, defiance with deep melancholy. They were figures who could not submit to authority because their very nature demanded autonomy, even when that autonomy brought only pain. Byron's personal life, marked by scandal and exile, made him particularly attuned to the psychology of the outcast, the one who violates social norms and suffers the consequences but cannot and will not conform to what society demands. The Byronic hero, as this character type came to be called, bore clear marks of Satan's influence. Proud, moody, rebellious, sexually transgressive, intellectually superior to those around them, scarred by some mysterious sin or suffering in their past, these figures dominated romantic literature and shaped how European culture understood the psychology of rebellion and alienation. They were attractive despite or perhaps because of their darkness, compelling in their refusal to play by conventional rules, magnetic in their combination of sophistication and savagery. Satan had been domesticated and romanticized, transformed from cosmic threat to misunderstood anti-hero. Goethe's Faust presented yet another influential reimagining of the devil figure through the character of Mephistopheles. This Satan was less a rebel against heaven than a cosmic cynic, a being who had seen everything and found it all equally meaningless. Mephistopheles was urbane and witty, a sophisticated philosophical interlocutor rather than a crude tempter. His wager with God over Faust's soul reframed the traditional contest between good and evil as a question about human nature and the meaning of striving and desire. In Goethe's treatment, Mephistopheles served as a catalyst for Faust's development rather than simply his corrupter. The devil enabled Faust to pursue knowledge and experience that would have been otherwise inaccessible, to live multiple lives and explore the full range of human possibility. Yes, this pursuit involved sin and suffering, both for Faust and for those caught up in his quest. But it also represented something valuable, a refusal to accept limitations, a commitment to endless growth and seeking even at enormous cost. Mephistopheles became in this reading not the enemy of humanity, but rather an essential goad, the force that prevented stagnation and drove the perpetual striving that Goethe saw as the highest human calling. The philosophical devil that Goethe created influenced countless subsequent treatments. This was a Satan who engaged in genuine dialogue, who made arguments that had to be taken seriously, who represented a perspective that could not be simply dismissed. He challenged conventional pieties and exposed hypocrisy, forced uncomfortable recognitions and demanded difficult choices. He was the voice of skepticism and doubt, the questioner who refused to accept received wisdom, the provocateur who delighted in overturning certainties and revealing the complexities beneath simple moral dichotomies. The romantic rehabilitation of Satan reflected broader cultural shifts occurring in European thought during this period. The authority of the Church was declining among intellectuals and artists. Traditional hierarchies were being questioned in the wake of the French Revolution, and individual freedom was increasingly valued over social conformity and obedience to authority. In this context, Satan's rebellion against divine tyranny could be read as an allegory for human liberation from oppressive political and religious systems. The fall from paradise became not a catastrophe, but an emancipation, the necessary price of consciousness and autonomy. The Romantic poets saw in Satan a mirror of their own situation as artists and intellectuals who challenged convention and suffered for it. They were themselves rebels of a sort, defying literary norms and social expectations, pursuing visions that society deemed dangerous or immoral. Satan became their patron saint, the archetype of the creative genius whose very greatness isolated them from ordinary humanity, who saw truths that others could not or would not acknowledge, who paid a terrible price for their refusal to compromise their vision. This reading of Satan emphasized his role as light-bearer, returning to the original meaning of the name Lucifer, but interpreting it in a new way. Satan brought light not through reflecting divine glory, but through stealing fire like Prometheus, through offering forbidden knowledge like the serpent in Eden, through illuminating truths that the authorities wanted to keep hidden. He was the enemy of ignorance and superstition, the champion of reason and inquiry, the patron of all who sought truth, regardless of what that truth might cost them or where it might lead. The transformation was not complete or universal. Christian orthodoxy continued to preach Satan as the enemy of souls, continued to warn against the sin of pride that had caused his fall, continued to frame the choice between God and devil as the ultimate moral decision facing every human being. But in literature and art, in the world of ideas and imagination, Satan had been fundamentally reimagined. He was no longer simply the villain of the cosmic drama, but had become its tragic hero, perhaps even its true protagonist. The implications of this shift were profound. If Satan could be read sympathetically, if his rebellion could be understood as motivated by legitimate grievances, if his pride could be seen as dignity and his defiance as courage, then the entire moral framework of traditional Christianity became questionable. What did it mean to call something evil if the supposedly evil figure displayed qualities like intelligence, courage, persistence, and commitment to principle? What did divine goodness consist of if it manifested primarily through arbitrary power and demanded submission without offering genuine choice? These questions, implicit in the Romantic readings of Satan, challenged the foundations of conventional morality and opened paths toward new ethical frameworks. The literary Satan of the Romantic period became a template for understanding all forms of rebellion and transgression. Revolutionary movements could draw on this imagery, framing their opposition to existing authorities as analogous to Satan's war against heaven. Artists and intellectuals could identify with the fallen angel's alienation and his commitment to truth over comfort. Individuals struggling against oppressive social norms could find in Satan's story a validation of their own resistance. The mythology had been liberated from its original religious context and made available for secular purposes, for political and personal applications that would have horrified the tradition's original custodians. Yet the romantic Satan retained his ambiguity and darkness even as he was elevated to heroic status. The poets who celebrated him did not pretend that rebellion came without cost or that pride was without its dangers. Satan remained tragic, his glory inseparable from his suffering, his freedom purchased at the price of everything he had once cherished. The Romantics understood that there was something self-destructive in the absolute commitment to autonomy, that the refusal to submit to anything outside oneself could lead to isolation and despair as easily as to liberation and authenticity. This ambiguity kept the figure vital and interesting, prevented him from becoming a simple symbol that could be deployed for straightforward political or philosophical purposes. Satan, in the romantic imagination, was not a problem that could be solved, but rather a question that had to be lived with, a tension that could not be resolved but only endured and explored. He represented the dark side of human aspiration, the shadow cast by the light of consciousness and will, the price that must be paid for refusing to accept easy answers and comfortable certainties. The occult revival of the 19th century produced interpretations of Lucifer that diverged dramatically from both traditional Christian demonology and romantic literary celebration. Within esoteric circles, initiatory orders, and alternative spiritual movements, Lucifer became a figure of cosmic significance whose true nature had been deliberately obscured by orthodox religion. These traditions claimed access to secret knowledge, hidden teachings that revealed Lucifer not as the enemy of humanity but as its benefactor, not as the source of evil but as the bearer of light and wisdom that the established powers sought to suppress. The distinction between Luciferianism and Satanism proved crucial for understanding these esoteric traditions. Satanism, at least in its traditional forms, involved the worship or veneration of Satan as understood within Christian cosmology, the deliberate choice to serve the force opposed to God. It was essentially reactive, defined by its opposition to Christianity, parasitic on Christian categories and values, even as it inverted them. Luciferianism, by contrast, claimed to transcend this opposition, to access a more ancient and more authentic understanding of the light-bearer that predated Christian distortions and revealed his true role in cosmic evolution. Luciferians argued that the figure demonized as Satan in Christian tradition was actually the liberator of humanity, the being who brought the gift of consciousness and the capacity for independent thought. The serpent in Eden was not the villain but the hero of the story, the one who freed humans from ignorance and elevated them to participation in divine knowledge. The fruit of the tree of knowledge was not corruption but enlightenment, not the cause of humanity's fall, but the catalyst for its rise toward godhood. From this perspective, the creator deity who forbade knowledge and demanded blind obedience was the true tyrant, while Lucifer was the revolutionary who broke the chains of ignorance and servitude. Gnostic Christianity, one of the earliest heresies from the perspective of Orthodox tradition, had already articulated versions of this understanding in the first centuries of the Common Era. Gnostic texts portrayed the material world as the creation not of the true divine source, but of a lesser deity called the demiurge, an ignorant or malevolent being who fashioned physical reality as a prison for spiritual beings. The serpent in some Gnostic accounts was an emissary from the true God beyond the demiurge, sent to liberate humanity from the false creator's control by offering knowledge that would reveal the prison for what it was. This Gnostic framework completely inverted the standard reading of the biblical narrative. The God of the Old Testament was not the supreme being, but rather the demiurge, the jealous and wrathful deity who wanted to keep humans ignorant and subservient. Lucifer became the representative of the true divine, the transcendent source that existed beyond material creation, whose intervention in Eden was an act of mercy aimed at awakening humans to their true spiritual nature. Salvation in this system meant not obedience to the Creator, but gnosis, direct knowledge of spiritual reality that allowed one to transcend the material prison and return to the pleroma, the fullness of divine being. The Theosophical Society, founded by Helena Blavatsky in the late 19th century, incorporated elements of Gnostic thinking into a grand synthesis that drew on Hindu and Buddhist concepts, along with Western esoteric traditions. Blavatsky's massive work, The Secret Doctrine, presented Lucifer as a cosmic principle rather than a personal being, the force of individuation and self-consciousness that was necessary for spiritual evolution. Lucifer represented the mind principle, the capacity for thought and reason that distinguished humans from animals and made spiritual progress possible. In theosophical cosmology, the fall of Lucifer symbolized not moral failure, but the descent of spirit into matter that was necessary for the development of individual consciousness. Without this fall, without the separation from unity that allowed for distinct centers of awareness, evolution would have been impossible. Lucifer was thus the great initiator, the being or principle whose sacrifice made human spiritual development possible. The light he brought was intellectual illumination, the awakening of mind that was both humanity's greatest gift and its greatest challenge, for mind could be used for either spiritual advancement or material entrapment. Blavatsky explicitly rejected the Christian characterization of Lucifer as evil, arguing that this was a deliberate distortion introduced by religious authorities who feared the empowerment of individuals through knowledge and reason. She named the Society's magazine Lucifer, intentionally reclaiming the term and asserting its original positive meaning as light-bearer and bringer of wisdom. This was a direct challenge to Christian orthodoxy, a declaration that esoteric spirituality would not accept the conventional categories and condemnations, but would instead pursue truth wherever it led, even if that meant rehabilitating the most vilified figure in Christian mythology. Aleister Crowley, the notorious British occultist who called himself the Great Beast and the wickedest man in the world, took the rehabilitation of Lucifer even further in his development of Thelema, the magical and philosophical system that would influence countless practitioners in the 20th century and beyond. Crowley's approach combined elements of ceremonial magic, Eastern mysticism, and radical individualism into a framework that made personal will the highest authority and spiritual principle. His most famous dictum, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," echoed Lucifer's rebellion in making individual desire and intention paramount over external commandments and social conventions. Crowley did not worship Satan in any conventional sense, for his system was too sophisticated and syncretic to reduce itself to simple devil worship. But his philosophy embodied the Luciferian principle of absolute autonomy, the rejection of external authority in favor of discovering and following one's true will. Every individual was a star, Crowley taught, a unique center of consciousness with its own proper orbit and purpose. To discover that true will and to pursue it without deviation was the great work of magic, the process by which one became fully oneself and aligned with one's cosmic purpose. The methods Crowley advocated for this discovery and this alignment included practices that conventional morality would condemn, sexual magic that violated taboos, ritual work that invoked demons and dark deities, drugs and altered states that dissolved ordinary consciousness. All of these were tools in the Thelemic arsenal. Crowley argued that conventional morality was slave morality, restrictions imposed by the weak to limit the strong, rules designed to suppress human potential rather than liberate it. True spiritual development required breaking these chains, transgressing boundaries, doing what one was told not to do in order to discover what one truly wanted and who one truly was. The magical tradition Crowley represented, often called the Western mystery tradition or ceremonial magic, had a complex relationship with demonic entities. Practitioners did not necessarily believe in these beings as objective realities, but worked with them as psychological archetypes or as representatives of particular forces and qualities that the magician wanted to understand or incorporate. To invoke a demon was not to worship evil, but rather to confront and integrate aspects of consciousness that conventional religions sought to repress and deny. The demons were the exiled parts of the psyche, the drives and desires that civilization required humans to suppress, but that retained their power in the unconscious and could be retrieved and employed through magical operation. The left-hand path, as this approach to spirituality came to be called, distinguished itself from the right-hand path of conventional religion through its embrace of the individual ego rather than its dissolution. Right-hand path traditions, whether Christian mysticism or Buddhist meditation or Hindu bhakti, generally sought to transcend the ego, to merge the individual self with God, or to recognize that the separate self was illusory and empty. The left-hand path, by contrast, aimed to strengthen and perfect the individual, to make the ego immortal and divine rather than to destroy it. This was explicitly Luciferian in its logic, the refusal to bow before any external authority, including the demand to surrender selfhood itself. Antinomian spirituality, the deliberate violation of religious law and moral norms as a spiritual practice, found theoretical justification in these esoteric interpretations of the Lucifer myth. If the established rules were tools of control rather than expressions of cosmic truth, if conventional morality served power rather than genuine good, then transgression became not sin, but liberation. The antinomian practitioner sought enlightenment through the very acts that society condemned, finding in taboo violation a path to authenticity and power that conformity could never provide. These traditions distinguished themselves sharply from what they called Hollywood Satanism, or rebel without a cause, devil worship. The true Luciferian or left-hand path practitioner was not interested in shocking people or in adolescent rebellion for its own sake. The goal was self-deification, the development of consciousness and will to their highest possible expression, the achievement of something like the immortality and power of the gods themselves. This required discipline, study, and sustained practice far more rigorous than anything conventional religion demanded. It was an elite path, they claimed, suitable only for those with exceptional will and intelligence, not a license for random transgression or self-indulgent excess. The Temple of Set, founded by Michael Aquino in the 1970s after splitting from the Church of Satan, represented a sophisticated modern expression of these ideas. Aquino drew on ancient Egyptian mythology, identifying Set as the Egyptian precursor to the figure later called Satan or Lucifer. Set was the principle of individual consciousness, the force of separation and distinction that allowed for genuine selfhood. The temple's philosophy emphasized the cultivation of individual excellence and the recognition that consciousness was not a product of material processes, but rather an eternal and independent principle that could be strengthened and perfected through magical and philosophical work. These esoteric traditions shared certain core commitments despite their many differences. All valued knowledge over faith, personal experience over received doctrine, individual authority over institutional hierarchy. All saw consciousness and will as divine in their own right, rather than mere attributes granted by an external creator. All understood spiritual development as an active process requiring effort and transgression rather than passive acceptance and obedience. And all rehabilitated Lucifer as a symbol of these values, the archetypal light-bearer whose gift of knowledge made genuine spirituality possible. The occult Lucifer served functions quite different from both the Christian Satan and the romantic rebel. He was not merely a literary character to be appreciated aesthetically or a villain to be feared and avoided. He was instead an operative spiritual principle, a force that could be worked with, a pathway to self-transformation and empowerment. The rituals and practices developed around this figure aimed to embody Luciferian qualities, to internalize the light-bearer's characteristics, to achieve in oneself the autonomy and illumination that the myth attributed to the fallen angel. Critics of these movements, both from traditional religious perspectives and from secular rationalist positions, saw in them dangerous delusion at best and genuine evil at worst. The embrace of figures and symbols associated with darkness and evil, whatever theoretical justifications were offered, seemed to open practitioners to psychological and spiritual harm. The emphasis on transgression and the rejection of moral limits appeared to authorize cruelty and exploitation. The focus on individual will and power seemed to produce narcissism and megalomania rather than genuine spiritual development. Yet defenders of esoteric Luciferianism argued that their critics misunderstood both the practices and their purposes. The transgression was not random but targeted, aimed at specific psychological and spiritual blockages that conventional morality created and maintained. The emphasis on individual will was not narcissism, but rather the necessary foundation for any genuine relationship with reality, for one could only truly give oneself after one had achieved genuine selfhood. The symbols of darkness were not celebrations of evil, but recognitions that growth required confronting the shadow, integrating the rejected parts of consciousness rather than projecting them onto others. The esoteric traditions also claimed to preserve knowledge that Orthodox religion had deliberately suppressed, wisdom teachings that revealed the true nature of reality and the human potential for transformation. Whether this knowledge was genuinely ancient or represented modern inventions dressed in antique garb remained disputed. But the practitioners experienced it as transformative, as providing frameworks for understanding and developing consciousness that conventional religion and secular materialism both failed to offer. The Luciferian path, they claimed, was the way of the spiritual elite, those brave and intelligent enough to seek truth rather than comfort, knowledge rather than security, power rather than safety. The 20th century brought Lucifer into new territories of interpretation and representation, transforming the ancient mythology through the lenses of psychology, existentialism, and mass media. The devil, who had once been a theological doctrine and then a literary character, became a cultural icon available for endless reinvention, appearing in contexts that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations. As traditional religious belief weakened its hold on Western consciousness, Lucifer paradoxically became more rather than less present in cultural imagination, freed from doctrinal constraints and available for creative reimagining in ways that served contemporary concerns and questions. Carl Jung's analytical psychology provided one of the most influential modern frameworks for understanding the Lucifer figure. Jung was not interested in whether Satan existed as an objective entity, but rather in what the devil represented psychologically, what function this archetype served in the human psyche. He saw Satan as a manifestation of the shadow, that portion of the self that contains everything the conscious ego rejects and denies, all the qualities and impulses that do not fit the self-image we construct and maintain. The shadow includes not only negative traits but also positive qualities that for various reasons we cannot accept or integrate into conscious identity. In Jungian terms, the Christian demonization of Lucifer represented a collective projection of the shadow onto an external figure. Rather than acknowledging darkness within themselves and within the divine, believers externalized it, created an enemy who embodied everything they feared and rejected. This projection served psychological functions, allowing individuals and communities to maintain a sense of purity and righteousness by attributing all evil to an outside source. But it also created profound problems, for the shadow cannot be destroyed through rejection and must eventually be integrated if wholeness is to be achieved. Jung argued that healthy psychological development required confronting the shadow, acknowledging the darkness within rather than projecting it outward. This meant recognizing one's own capacity for evil, one's own destructive impulses and forbidden desires, not to act on them indiscriminately, but to understand them as part of the totality of what one is. The Lucifer myth, from this perspective, became a story about the necessity and danger of this confrontation. Satan represented the shadow in its autonomous and threatening form, the darkness that will not stay suppressed but erupts destructively when denied. But Lucifer, the light-bearer, suggested the possibility of bringing consciousness to the darkness, of illuminating the shadow rather than simply fearing it. This psychological reading made Lucifer relevant to a secular age that had largely abandoned literal belief in supernatural entities. One did not need to believe in an actual devil to recognize the psychological and cultural patterns that the mythology described. The rebellion against authority, the desire for autonomy, the temptation to transgress boundaries, the ambiguous relationship between consciousness and innocence, all of these themes resonated with modern experience regardless of one's religious commitments. Lucifer became a symbol for understanding inner conflicts and developmental challenges that every individual faced in the process of maturation and self-realization. The rebel archetype that Lucifer embodied proved particularly potent in an era marked by questioning of traditional authority and social revolution. The counterculture movements of the 1960s and 1970s, the various liberation struggles that challenged established hierarchies, the artistic and intellectual trends that valued transgression and innovation over tradition and conformity, all of these found in Lucifer a convenient symbol. He represented the refusal to accept things as they are, the demand for transformation and renewal, the courage to stand alone against overwhelming opposition. Whether one interpreted this positively or negatively depended largely on one's relationship to the authorities being challenged. Contemporary literature explored Lucifer through increasingly sophisticated and varied lenses. Mikhail Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita presented Satan as Wuland, a charismatic and ambiguous figure whose visit to Soviet Moscow exposed hypocrisy and punished corruption while also causing chaos and suffering. The novel's complex portrait resisted simple moral categorization, showing the devil as simultaneously destructive and strangely just, terrifying and weirdly appealing. Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials trilogy reimagined the war in heaven as a rebellion against a tyrannical deity who falsely claimed to be the creator, explicitly framing the rebel angels as heroes and their opposition as morally necessary. Television and film brought Lucifer to mass audiences in forms that would have scandalized earlier generations. The television series Lucifer, based loosely on the comic book character from Neil Gaiman's Sandman, portrayed the devil as a charming nightclub owner who had abandoned hell to live in Los Angeles, solving crimes and exploring questions about free will, punishment, and redemption. This Lucifer was sophisticated and sympathetic, a protagonist rather than an antagonist, someone whose rebellion seemed justified and whose character arc involved not defeat, but growth and healing. The show's popularity demonstrated how thoroughly the figure had been rehabilitated in popular consciousness. Other contemporary portrayals ranged from the terrifying to the comic, from the theological to the purely secular. Horror films continued to mine the traditional imagery of satanic evil, producing demons and possessions that drew on centuries of accumulated iconography. But even in this genre, more interesting treatments complicated the simple good versus evil framework, exploring psychological and social dimensions of what got labeled as demonic. The devil became a metaphor for various contemporary anxieties, from nuclear annihilation to environmental collapse to the alienation produced by technological society. The Satanic Temple, founded in 2012, represented a particularly interesting modern appropriation of satanic imagery for explicitly political and social purposes. Unlike traditional Satanists or occult practitioners, the Satanic Temple was primarily interested in church-state separation and civil liberties rather than in spiritual or magical practice. The organization used Satan as a symbol of rebellion against religious authority and as a rhetorical device for exposing religious privilege in public spaces. When Christian groups demanded the right to place Ten Commandments monuments on government property, the Satanic Temple responded by demanding equal space for satanic monuments, forcing a confrontation with the contradictions in religious freedom arguments. This political Satan was neither the cosmic evil of traditional theology nor the spiritual principle of esoteric traditions. He was instead a provocative symbol, chosen precisely because of the discomfort and outrage he provoked, deployed to make points about religious equality and secular governance. The Satanic Temple's tenets emphasized compassion, justice, and scientific reason rather than anything recognizably satanic in the traditional sense. The group practiced a kind of satirical activism, using the devil's image to hold a mirror up to religious hypocrisy and political injustice. Their Satan was a rhetorical weapon rather than an object of devotion, a way of challenging power through calculated offense and strategic irreverence. Existentialist philosophy provided another lens through which modern thinkers understood the Lucifer myth. Jean-Paul Sartre's insistence that existence precedes essence, that humans create themselves through their choices rather than fulfilling predetermined natures, echoed Lucifer's rebellion against the role assigned to him by divine decree. The existentialist emphasis on radical freedom and the accompanying anguish of responsibility resonated with Satan's position as the being who chose autonomy, even knowing the consequences. Albert Camus' absurd hero, who creates meaning in a meaningless universe through perpetual rebellion against fate, owed something to the Luciferian archetype of defiance in the face of cosmic injustice. The existentialist reading of the fall emphasized not the sin or the punishment, but rather the birth of authentic choice. In paradise, Adam and Eve existed in a state of innocence that was also a state of pre-conscious automaticity. They did not make genuine choices because they lacked the knowledge and awareness that genuine choosing requires. The serpent's gift of knowledge was thus the gift of existential freedom, the terrible and wonderful capacity to choose one's own values and create one's own meaning. The price of this gift was the loss of security and certainty, the burden of freedom that Sartre famously declared humans were condemned to bear. But the gain was authentic existence, the possibility of being truly, rather than merely existing as an object in someone else's design. In the age of secularism, when literal belief in supernatural entities declined sharply among educated populations, Lucifer persisted as a cultural symbol whose meanings multiplied rather than diminished. For some, he remained a useful fiction, a character through which to explore psychological and ethical questions. For others, he represented historical forces of rebellion and liberation that could be invoked and celebrated without any metaphysical commitments. For still others, he functioned as a warning about the dangers of pride and autonomy taken to extremes. The diversity of interpretations testified to the myth's continuing relevance and its capacity to be adapted to changing contexts and concerns. Post-religious thought, emerging from communities that had left behind traditional faith but still sought meaning and connection, found in the Lucifer story a narrative that resonated with their own experiences. The fall from the certainties of religious belief into the ambiguities of skepticism and doubt paralleled Lucifer's fall from heaven. The loss of community and identity that often accompanied religious exit echoed Satan's exile and isolation. But there was also something potentially empowering in the parallel, a suggestion that the fall might be not catastrophe but liberation, that losing paradise might be the price of gaining authentic self-determination. The various satanic and Luciferian movements that emerged in the 20th century, from Anton LaVey's Church of Satan to more serious occult organizations, demonstrated the range of ways that modern people could relate to this ancient figure. LaVey's Satanism was essentially atheistic, using Satan as a symbol for individualism and rational self-interest, rather than as an actual entity to be worshipped. His satanic Bible combined Ayn Rand-style egoism with carnival showmanship, appealing to those who wanted to thumb their noses at conventional religion while pursuing material success and personal pleasure. This was Satan as lifestyle brand, a way of signaling nonconformity and sophistication through calculated transgression and aesthetic choice. More serious practitioners approached Lucifer as a genuine spiritual principle or even as a conscious entity with whom relationship was possible. These groups varied widely in their beliefs and practices, from those who saw themselves as part of ancient traditions to those who were consciously creating new forms of spirituality for the modern age. What united them was the conviction that conventional religion had failed to address authentic spiritual needs, and that the demonized figure of Lucifer actually pointed towards something valuable and true that orthodoxy had suppressed. The question of whether any of these modern interpretations captured something real about Lucifer, or whether they were merely projections onto a mythological screen, admitted no easy answer. The psychological readings emphasized that Lucifer was a symbol produced by human consciousness to deal with human concerns. The political uses treated him as a useful fiction, a rhetorical device with no existence beyond his cultural representation. The spiritual practitioners claimed direct experience of Luciferian energy or presence that could not be reduced to psychology or politics. Each perspective had its own logic and its own evidence, its own way of validating itself and dismissing alternatives. What seemed clear was that Lucifer in the modern age had become something like a Rorschach test, an ambiguous stimulus onto which people projected their own concerns and commitments. Conservatives saw in contemporary Lucifer worship evidence of moral decline and spiritual danger. Progressives saw in the symbol a challenge to unjust authority and a celebration of individual autonomy. Artists found in the mythology rich material for exploring the darker aspects of consciousness and society. Scholars analyzed the figure as a cultural construct that revealed the values and anxieties of the societies that produced and transformed him. Each perspective illuminated some aspect of the phenomenon while leaving others in shadow. The devil in the age of secularism proved more rather than less complex than the devil of earlier eras. Without a single authoritative interpretation enforced by religious institutions, the mythology exploded into countless variations and adaptations. Lucifer could be villain or hero, symbol or reality, warning or inspiration, all depending on who was telling the story and for what purpose. This very multiplicity testified to the enduring power of the archetype, its capacity to continue generating meaning and provoking response even after the cosmological framework that originally produced it had lost its grip on educated consciousness. The story of Lucifer endures because it addresses questions that remain perpetually relevant to conscious beings, questions that cannot be finally answered but must be continuously gauged. At its core, the mythology explores the tension between freedom and obedience, between autonomy and belonging, between the desire to determine one's own path and the need to exist in relationship with something larger than oneself. These tensions are not unique to angels or to mythological narratives, but rather structure the fundamental dilemmas of conscious existence. Every individual who becomes aware of themselves as a self faces versions of the choice that Lucifer confronted, and every society must grapple with how to balance individual liberty against collective order. The philosophical legacy of the fallen angel extends far beyond theology into ethics, politics, psychology, and metaphysics. In ethics, Lucifer raises questions about whether obedience to authority can be virtuous if it is not chosen freely, whether submission that is coerced or manipulated deserves to be called good. The angel who rebelled did so in the name of principles he believed were higher than any command, and his story forces reflection on when and whether defiance becomes morally necessary. Must we obey power simply because it is power, Are there limits to legitimate authority beyond which rebellion becomes not just permissible but required? These questions animated political revolutions and continue to challenge every hierarchical system that claims the right to command and receive obedience. In political thought, the Lucifer myth provided a template for understanding the relationship between rulers and ruled, between the state and the individual, between law and liberty. Tyrannical governments could be cast as the creator god demanding absolute submission, while revolutionaries became the heirs of Lucifer's rebellion, willing to risk everything for the sake of freedom. But the myth also served as a warning about the dangers of prideful ambition and the chaos that could follow when established order was overthrown without adequate alternatives. The same story could justify both revolution and reaction, could support both the struggle for liberation and the defense of stability, depending on which elements were emphasized and which perspective was taken. The psychological dimension of the Lucifer mythology illuminates the development of individual consciousness and the challenges of maturation. The fall from paradise parallels the loss of childhood innocence that every person experiences in becoming an adult. There is a state of undifferentiated unity, a time before self-consciousness, when the child exists in seamless connection with parents and environment. But growth requires separation, the development of an individual ego distinct from its surroundings. This necessary process brings pain and loss, even as it makes possible genuine agency and authentic relationship. The person who never falls, who never separates, who never rebels, remains in a kind of psychological infancy regardless of their chronological age. From this perspective, Lucifer represents the archetypal adolescent, the one who must reject parental authority in order to discover independent identity. The rebellion may appear excessive, the pride may seem disproportionate, the defiance may cause unnecessary suffering, but these are the natural and perhaps inevitable characteristics of the separation process, the ways that consciousness asserts its autonomy even at great cost. The tragedy is that separation does not lead to the freedom and fulfillment that the rebel anticipates, but rather to a different and perhaps more difficult set of constraints and responsibilities. Adult freedom proves to be not liberation from all limits, but rather the burden of having to create one's own meaning without the security of externally provided purpose. What the Lucifer story reveals about human nature is profoundly ambiguous. On one hand, it shows the glory of conscious beings who can conceive of alternatives to existing conditions, who can imagine better worlds and work toward their realization, who refuse to accept injustice simply because it is powerful. The capacity to say no to authority, to resist domination, to insist on dignity even at enormous cost, these are among humanity's most admirable characteristics. Every advance in human rights, every extension of freedom, every challenge to oppressive systems has required individuals willing to play the Luciferian role, to defy power and risk punishment for the sake of principles they held higher than their own safety. On the other hand, the myth illuminates the destructive potential of pride and the dangers of autonomy pursued without wisdom or restraint. Lucifer's rebellion brought suffering not just to himself but to countless others, caught up in the cosmic drama that followed his fall. His corruption of humanity introduced death and pain into a world that had been created good. His continued opposition to divine order perpetuates conflict and chaos rather than resolving into a stable alternative. The story warns that not every rebel is a hero, that defiance can stem from vice as easily as from virtue, that the desire for autonomy can become a kind of prison when it refuses all connection and rejects all limitation. The enduring power of the mythology in contemporary spirituality demonstrates that ancient symbols retain their capacity to speak to modern concerns. In an age marked by increasing individualism and the breakdown of traditional communal structures, Lucifer's story of exile and isolation resonates with widespread experiences of loneliness and disconnection. In a time when authority is questioned and hierarchies are challenged across every domain, his rebellion against divine command seems increasingly relevant rather than archaic. In a culture saturated with information but starving for wisdom, his role as light-bearer and knowledge-giver takes on new significance and new complexity. Contemporary spiritual seekers relate to Lucifer in ways that previous generations might have found incomprehensible or horrifying. For some, he represents the courage to leave behind religious traditions that no longer serve, to step into the uncertainty of creating one's own meaning and values without the security of revealed truth. For others, he symbolizes the integration of shadow and light, the recognition that wholeness requires acknowledging darkness rather than projecting it onto external enemies. For still others, he functions as a reminder that growth often requires transgression, that boundaries must sometimes be violated for development to occur, that rules exist to be questioned even when they cannot be safely ignored. The question of whether Lucifer's fall was tragedy or triumph, catastrophe or liberation, punishment or fulfillment, remains perpetually open. The mythology itself refuses to resolve into a single clear message, instead holding multiple possibilities in tension. This very ambiguity may be the source of its power, the reason it continues to generate interpretation and controversy millennia after its original formulation. A myth that could be definitively decoded and exhaustively explained would lose its vitality, would become a problem solved rather than a question lived. Lucifer remains alive in cultural imagination precisely because his story resists closure, because every answer generates new questions, because understanding deepens rather than resolves the paradoxes at its heart. The price of independence that Lucifer paid was separation from the source of his being, exile from the presence that had defined and sustained his existence. This price was not arbitrary punishment, but rather the natural consequence of the choice itself, for to demand autonomy is necessarily to create distance from that which one is claiming autonomy from. One cannot simultaneously be unified with something and independent from it, cannot both derive one's being from another and be self-sufficient. The logic of separation means that genuine autonomy requires accepting loneliness, that freedom from external determination includes freedom from external support, that sovereignty means standing alone even when the costs of solitude become unbearable. Yet there remains something deeply appealing in Lucifer's defiant declaration that it is better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. The statement captures a truth about dignity and self-respect that resonates regardless of religious commitments. There are forms of service that diminish rather than ennoble, forms of obedience that corrupt rather than perfect, forms of submission that violate the integrity of conscious being. When authority becomes tyrannical, when power becomes abusive, when commands violate conscience, then obedience may be the greater sin and rebellion the more virtuous path. Lucifer's choice, however terrible its consequences, preserved something essential about what it means to be a conscious being with will and judgment and the capacity to choose one's own values. The mythology forces confrontation with the possibility that consciousness itself is inherently tragic, that awareness brings suffering that innocence avoids, that the capacity for choice includes the capacity for catastrophic error. Paradise was characterized by unity and harmony, by the absence of conflict and the presence of perfect order. But it was also characterized by dependence and limitation, by the absence of genuine autonomy and the presence of external authority that could not be questioned. The fall brought death and pain and exile, brought the burden of moral responsibility and the anguish of existential freedom. But it also brought authentic agency, the capacity for creativity and growth, the possibility of relationships based on choice rather than design. Perhaps the deepest question the Lucifer mythology raises is whether there can be genuine love without the possibility of refusal, genuine loyalty without the capacity for betrayal, genuine virtue without the option of vice. If angels and humans were created so that they could only choose the good, then their righteousness would be mechanical rather than moral. Their obedience would be programming rather than devotion. Their love would be automatic rather than authentic. For choice to be real, there must be genuine alternatives, including alternatives that lead to disaster and suffering. The Creator who grants will to creatures necessarily risks that those creatures will use their will to oppose the Creator's intentions. From this perspective, Lucifer's fall was not a flaw in the design, but rather a demonstration of the design working exactly as intended. The system was constructed to allow for genuine freedom, and genuine freedom necessarily includes the possibility of catastrophic misuse. Satan is not a mistake or an accident, but rather the permanent possibility inherent in any cosmos that contains conscious beings with will. Evil is not an invasion from outside creation, but rather a potential written into the code from the beginning, the dark side of the gift of consciousness and autonomy. To eliminate the possibility of falling would require eliminating the conditions that make rising meaningful. The morning star's fall illuminates the fundamental paradox of conscious existence. We are beings who can imagine perfection but cannot achieve it, who can conceive of alternatives but cannot escape the consequences of choosing them, who want both the security of belonging and the freedom of autonomy, but discover that these goods conflict in ways that admit no perfect resolution. We want to be ourselves while also being connected, want to create our own meaning while also participating in something larger than ourselves, want to be free from external control while also being supported and sustained by relationships with others. These tensions cannot be eliminated but only navigated, cannot be solved but only lived. Lucifer stands at the intersection of these tensions, embodying them in their most extreme and dramatic form. He is the light-bearer who brought knowledge at the cost of innocence, the rebel who chose dignity over happiness, the exile who maintained his integrity at the price of everything else. His story does not resolve the questions it raises, but rather deepens them, does not provide answers, but rather illuminates the complexity of the questions themselves. This is why the mythology endures, why it continues to generate interpretation and identification, why it remains relevant across radically different cultural contexts and historical periods. In the end, the story of Lucifer is the story of consciousness itself, of beings who become aware of themselves and their situation, and must then decide how to respond to that awareness. It is the story of the price of knowledge and the burden of freedom, of the glory and tragedy of beings who can say no even to God, of the terrible beauty of autonomy pursued regardless of consequence. The morning star fell for freedom, or fell into it, or fell because of it, and in that fall opened possibilities and problems that define what it means to be a conscious being in a universe where consciousness is both gift and curse, both liberation and exile, both the highest achievement of existence and its deepest wound.